Hey there, everybody. So today we're doing something a little bit different. This is going to be a little less scripted, a little less structured. This video is my story of how I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 19 years old and how that diagnosis stuck with me until I was 25. As a huge disclaimer, bipolar is absolutely a valid diagnosis for many, many people. It just wasn't the correct diagnosis for me. And I know that misdiagnosis is really, really common amongst auDHDers, people who are both autistic and ADHD. It actually takes an average of 11 years for an autistic person to receive an accurate diagnosis, and bipolar is one of the most common misdiagnoses for both autism and ADHD. How do I know all this? Because I did a lot of research for it for my book, which is coming out later this year. If you'd like to get on the wait list to make sure you don't miss it, go ahead to the description below. So let's just dive into the story, right? So I get diagnosed when I'm 19 years old when I go off to college. How exactly did that happen? See, when I was living at home, I had a lot of practical support that I lost when I went to college. I have 3 younger siblings and 2 parents who are together, and I was raised with all 6 of us in one house, and I had a lot of help with things like dishes, laundry, picking up the dog poop, chores basically. It had a lot of support and a lot of structure. I also don't know how much my family would agree with me on this, but I think I grew up in a pretty neurodivergent family, even though we didn't know it when I was growing up. So there were a lot of accommodations that were just normal in my household. They were just things we did for each other or for ourselves to accommodate our, what I now know is neurodivergent brains. Things like when my parents would leave for work in the morning and there was stuff they needed us to do before we left for school, they would leave notes in the silverware drawer because they knew if they left it on the counter, we wouldn't notice it at all. But if they put it in a place that was physically in the way of us eating our morning cereal, we would notice the note and we couldn't say, oh, I didn't see it, it was on top of your spoon, you saw it. I also want to give a huge shout out to my mom, who is an incredible cook and who loves to cook. And because of that, I had a home cooked meal pretty much every single night of my life. And we ate it together around the table of the family. And those are some of my favorite memories growing up. Just, all of us talking over each other, interrupting each other at the dinner table, eating something delicious, by the way. So when I left for school, I lost a lot of that support. I lost those home cooked meals. I lost the accommodations I didn't even know I needed. I lost a lot of support. And at the same time, going to school meant leaving an environment that wasn't always super helpful for me. And at the same time, leaving for school meant leaving the house that I grew up in, the house that, like I said, had so much practical support, but not always a ton of emotional support. So leaving for college meant that I could finally acknowledge these huge feelings I had had my whole life. But that was hard too, because I didn't know what to do with them. I was taught 0 skills for dealing with big emotions. I was basically just taught to not have them. And I think this combination of losing the practical support, but also losing the emotional repression that I was experiencing resulted in my emotions bubbling up to the surface in a way I had never dealt with before, while also not having the practical support around me to help keep myself contained. And as a result, my mental health really fell apart. I experienced a ton of depression. I cried constantly. I was so tired. I was so sad all the time about nothing, everything. It literally felt like there was a boulder on my chest most of the time. And I also think, looking back with the advantage of hindsight, I can say that my attachment wounds were really, really activated when I first went off to college. I was really, really desperate to make friends and to feel connected to people and to feel validated by others. This led to me being a very enthusiastic friend, and sometimes maybe a little over enthusiastic, maybe a little over eager to share and to have others share with me. And as a result, it sort of created this up and down, high and low, that, as we all know, was interpreted as bipolar disorder. I actually finally got diagnosed because of the movie Frozen. I was home for Thanksgiving break, and I remember this moment so clearly. I was vacuuming the dining room, and I was, moving the chairs out so that I could vacuum more easily. And as I was lifting a chair, it literally felt like someone had cracked an egg on my head, and I felt the exhaustion and sadness and depression just cover me. And I was like, not this shit again. I was so exhausted by it. And I just remember my whole life feels, even now, like it is divided into before that moment and after that moment. Because that moment is when I felt so horrible and so hopeless. I didn't know what to do. And so I kind of just kept living my life. I kept vacuuming the dining room. Like, what are you supposed to do when your world ends and nothing happened and you can't explain it? And your family doesn't talk about mental health very much. So you don't know what to even say or how to describe what you're going through. So I kept vacuuming, and then later that night, my then boyfriend, now husband, and I took my younger siblings to go see Frozen. And you guys know that scene where Elsa is grieving her parents and she's in her room and the snowflakes are held perfectly still. I sobbed when I saw that scene. Like loud, ugly sobs in the middle of the movie theater. Like my siblings were kind of looking over like, what is going on with Megan? And that was the night I decided to get help. That was the night I decided I needed help. So when I got back to school, I went on the school's counseling website and they had a depression screener, which is basically just a couple of questions to say like, hey, is there a good chance you're depressed or is there a good chance it's something else? And so it's not diagnostic, but it's a good way for you to kind of determine what might be going on. So I took that and the results literally changed my life because the results said, yes, you are absolutely experiencing depression, but you're also showing some signs of bipolar disorder and you should talk to a professional. And I think a big reason that I got that result is actually because of the attachment wounds that I mentioned before. You know, I was a very overeager friend. I would stay up to all hours talking with people about their emotional drama. I was very much the therapist friend who desperately needed a therapist of her own. But when I got that result saying that I might have bipolar disorder, I felt something I don't know that I had felt before, which was so much validation. I had never had my big feelings taken seriously before, and bipolar felt serious. It felt like someone finally saw the amount of distress I was often in. And that's a big reason that the bipolar misdiagnosis stuck around for so long, because it was so validating. And in my head, if it wasn't bipolar, the only alternative I knew was that it was nothing and I was a baby, a crybaby, dramatic, whiny, too sensitive. So when I did go see a therapist at school, I told them, hey, I think I have bipolar, and I explained why, and they told me, and I quote, "You certainly paint a bipolar picture." And those words have always haunted me a little bit because it kind of makes it sound like I was trying to convey that I had bipolar, not that I actually did have bipolar. And I tried to address that with my therapist many times over the years because I saw her for like 6 years while I did my undergrad and then my master's degree. And every time she's like, no, Megan, like, that's not what I meant by that. You have bipolar, like, that's what I'm saying. But I couldn't shake this feeling that nobody believed me. And again, this probably comes from the fact that growing up, my emotions were not always very validated. It was like, okay, but like, why are you feeling something so big over something so small? It doesn't make sense, so just don't feel it. Like, if it doesn't make sense, then it must not be true. That's actually a big point of healing I've had to do, is that sometimes I'm going to feel and do and be things that don't make sense, and that doesn't make me wrong. So the therapist tentatively diagnosed me with bipolar type 2 in our very first meeting. Now, this is not me slamming my therapist. She was really great and really helpful, but I do question this decision. I know I was desperate for a label, and I was desperate for that label to be bipolar because I thought it was the only thing that could explain me. But bipolar is a tricky diagnosis, and most therapists agree that it takes months to diagnose bipolar accurately. It's hard to fault this therapist for diagnosing me right away because I was so distressed, and she probably saw the diagnosis as a way to potentially calm me down enough to work on the issues at hand. But at the same time, I wonder if diagnosing me right away was the right call. I then proceeded to spend the next 6 years absolutely obsessed with bipolar disorder and absolutely convinced at the same time that I did have it and that I didn't. I developed pretty severe health anxiety, which used to be known as hypochondria, around my mental health specifically. I thought about it all the time. I think on a good day, like 70% of my thoughts were about my mental health. Everything else I did, my relationships, my schoolwork, only got 30% of my brain. And it was really exhausting. It was really hard and really terrible, and it was ruining my relationships. My boyfriend was avoiding my texts because he just couldn't bear to have the same conversations with me over and over and over. I tried different medications, none of which worked very well for me until we finally started trying an antidepressant. If you don't know, a lot of folks with bipolar do not take antidepressants, or at least not traditional SSRIs, because it can increase the likelihood of mania. However, the first time I actually started to feel better was the moment I was put on an antidepressant. I mean, I wrote poems about this medication. That is how much better it made me feel. And this probably should have been the first clue to me and my team that bipolar might not be the right diagnosis. Now, to be fair, a lot of folks with bipolar type 2 take a mood stabilizer in addition to an antidepressant, and sometimes those medicines can balance each other out. None of this is medical advice, by the way. I'm not a doctor, but this is my experience with taking medication, and I think it's important to talk about that. But anyway, that probably should have been clue number one. We're gonna take a little break. We're just gonna shake it out. We're gonna do a little stimming because I am actually starting to dissociate a little bit as I tell this story, because it is a difficult story for me. It represents a really difficult time in my life. So we're just gonna like move a little. I'm gonna take a sip of my Celsius and try to ground myself in this present moment and just acknowledge that I'm okay. I am safe. I have an accurate diagnosis now. This time was hard, but this time is over. All right, let's dive back into it. Where was I? My team probably should have noticed that I might not have bipolar when we dealt with some of the medication issues. I also think maybe we should have questioned my diagnosis when the diagnosis wasn't helping me get better. I really struggled throughout all of college, all of grad school. I just struggled. My grades were pretty good. I think I graduated magna cum laude, which is like the second highest. So like my grades were fine, but school has always been something I thoroughly enjoy. But emotionally, I was a wreck, you guys. At the time, I experienced what I thought were mixed episodes, which is something that can happen in bipolar, where you have all of the negative thoughts and feelings of depression, but you have all of the energy of mania. I called them my orange times because it reminded me of the color orange, like a traffic cone, a caution light, you know, danger. That's how I felt. I now realize that these were likely autistic meltdowns, but at the time, the language I had was a mixed episode, and either way, they sucked, and I experienced them a lot. And I felt like shit all the time. I was having mental breakdowns all the time. I couldn't sleep. I just was in so much distress and in so much pain for so long. So you might be wondering, Megan, what changed? How did you finally like break out of all of this? And what changed is I graduated. I had to stop seeing my mental health team and move back home, and I had to build a new mental health team. And the new therapist I got turned out to be pretty rough. There's a whole story about that. Remind me to do a video about bad therapists. But she was really important because she was the first person to look at me and say, you know that you've experienced trauma, right? And that your emotions make sense given what you've gone through. And that was huge for me. She told me, and I quote, if you have bipolar, it's a very unusual form, and trauma much more likely explains your symptoms. So I started keeping a trigger log. Anytime I felt a really big emotion, I would write down the emotion I felt, and I would kind of fill it out backwards, right? So I would write down the emotion I felt, then I would write down what happened, and then I would kind of start to piece together, why do I think this thing that happened maybe triggered this big emotion? And at first it was embarrassing. Honestly, it's still a little embarrassing to look at my own trigger logs because the things that can trigger me are so fucking small, y'all. I'm not even joking. The other night, I have been doing trauma work for years. You would think this stuff wouldn't bother me anymore, but alas, here we go. The other night, I showed my husband a video of a singer I really, really liked singing a song I really, really liked, and I was like, isn't this just amazing? And he was like, oh, well, I preferred this person who sang it. Crushed. Wind out of my sails, felt dismissed, felt invalidated, felt like what I liked was stupid, none of which he said, by the way. This kind of stuff just, it's so small, but it represents something so big to me. Basically, my brain is always asking, am I okay? Am I safe? Am I the person I'm supposed to be? Am I good? Anytime people disagree with me, or heck, even don't agree with me enthusiastically enough, it is so triggering for me. And this therapist helped me work through a lot of that. And yeah, it ended badly, and I'll tell you all about that some other time, but I'll always be grateful to her because that was when I finally let go of the bipolar diagnosis. Now, it would still be a few years before I got diagnosed with autism and ADHD, but just being able to let go of the bipolar diagnosis and to acknowledge that trauma explained a lot of what was going on in my life was huge for me. Letting go of something that has been a part of you for 6 years is not easy. There was a lot of back and forth. I had a lot of doubts. I was afraid that letting go of the bipolar diagnosis meant, you know, like I said, nothing was wrong. I was this crybaby, too sensitive, dramatic, whatever. But I'm happy to report that I understand my brain much better now, and I feel much more at peace with who I am as a person and the diagnoses that help me understand myself. If you were misdiagnosed too, I hope that this video makes you feel seen, and I hope you know that you're not alone and that the answers are out there. You're not bad. You're exactly who you're supposed to be. And I'm glad you're here. I'll see you all next time.